Recording in progress. Hello from the Asian Development Bank in Manila. My name is Steve Goldfinch and I'm with ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on unlocking opportunities to deliver disaster resilient infrastructure in Asia and the Pacific. ADB is convening today's webinar to mark the launch of a new report and to provide a space for us to collectively explore practical opportunities for disaster resilient infrastructure in the region. We have some great speakers and an expert panel today. Please do use the Q&A box throughout the session to ask your questions, and we will get to these towards the end of the session. Now, to get things going, it's my pleasure to invite Noelle O'Brien to give some opening remarks. Noelle is ADB's Chief of Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management. Prior to assuming this role, Noelle led ADB's climate change work in the Pacific. Noelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. And can I just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
So ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, on behalf of the Asian Development Bank, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on unlocking opportunities to deliver disaster resilient infrastructure in Asia and the Pacific. And thank you for asking me to join you today. We have two objectives with today's webinar. The first is to share the new report that ADB is releasing today that discusses and identifies opportunities towards realizing disaster resilient infrastructure across the region. And the second is to provide a platform to discuss how we collectively can achieve greater resilience in the built environment. We're pleased today to be joined by Vivid Economics and the Asian Disaster Preparedness Centre. I also want to note that the report being launched today received support from the Japan Fund for Prosperous and Resilient Asia and the Pacific. This is financed by the government of Japan through the ADB. Disasters triggered by natural hazards threaten the long-term sustainability of development in the Asia-Pacific region. Countries across the region face significant disaster and climate risk. Over the last decade alone, extreme weather events and geophysical hazards caused direct losses averaging $58 billion per year, or $159 million per day. The escalation in disaster losses underscores the urgency of addressing disaster risk adequately when planning and designing infrastructure. Disaster risk is an especially pressing concern given the region's huge infrastructure investment requirements over the next 20 years. Combined with the expected adverse impact of climate change, which will make extreme weather more uncertain and potentially far more frequent and intense. The reality is that every dollar spent rebuilding could have been used on any of the many other pressing social and economic priorities of developing countries, or on the private sector expanding production services and employment opportunities. Earlier reporting by ADB estimates that developing Asia must invest $26 trillion from 2016 to 2030, or $1.7 trillion per year to maintain its growth momentum, eradicate poverty, and to respond to climate change. Infrastructure resilience therefore presents both an immense challenge and a critical opportunity for Asia and the Pacific. How and where investments are made will largely determine the region's ability to cope with the disaster and climate risks for decades to come. Ensuring investments are risk-informed will prevent or at least reduce the impact of natural hazards on assets and systems. It is this opportunity that brings us here today. ADB is pleased to be launching a new publication to better understand the entry points to delivering disaster resilient infrastructure. We hope that this publication will contribute to discussions across capitals and throughout the private sector, looking at how to increase the resilience of assets as well as the wider systems that these assets support. As we will hear shortly, approaches to addressing the challenges faced beyond access to beyond access to finance are explored in the report. These include risk assessment, investment appraisal, operation and maintenance across the life cycle of the infrastructure asset, and ways of achieving system-wide resilience objectives and implementing effective governance models. ADB is committed to achieving a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific. With this publication and today's webinar, we hope to contribute to this discourse and to encourage dialogue among and between our developing member countries and their development partners. So thank you very much. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Noelle, for those remarks. Before we continue, we'd like to show a short video to help set the scene.
Infrastructure has played a critical role in Asia and the Pacific's rapid economic growth. Roads, bridges, power networks, and others are part of people's daily lives and a foundation of their economic opportunity. But climate change is forcing us to rethink how we manage infrastructure. The increasing regularity of floods, cyclones, and droughts means infrastructure must change with it. More and more, infrastructure needs to not only drive economic growth, but also protect against economic harm. This requires infrastructure to be more resilient to disasters. Resilient infrastructure can deliver so much. It can save lives and reduce damage and loss to assets during a disaster. But it also provides benefits regardless of whether a disaster strikes. It can unlock economic potential and achieve fiscal stability. It can protect biodiversity and mitigate climate change. All in all, prioritizing the resilience of our infrastructure can change the way we view investments and achieve sustainable economic growth. Asia and the Pacific needs resilient infrastructure, and the time for that is now.
To unpack the findings of the report being launched, I'd like to hand over to Oliver Walker from Vivid Economics. Ollie and his team from Vivid, together with the Asian DisasterPreparedness Centre, contributed to the research and preparation of the report. Ollie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Is my audio working well for everyone? Good. So thank you all very much for joining this session. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to present this work. My name's Ollie Walker. I'm a director at Vivid Economics. I lead our work on climate and disaster risk and resilience. And I led the consultancy team, including Alessa Vidmeyer, Neeraj Barua, and Teresa Lederer from Vivid, as well as Bill Ho, Aslam Peruz from ADPC, and working together very closely with Steve, Mario, and Faisal and colleagues from ADB on this work. So our starting point for this piece of work was twofold. Firstly, as Noelle set out so compellingly, this is a critical issue in developing Asia. We know that infrastructure is critical to growth and inclusion in the region. And we know that resilience, not just of the infrastructure assets themselves, but of the services and the social and economic systems it supports, is essential to delivering these benefits. The second starting point was in the context of all this richness, there's a need for practical guidance, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and accounting for the capacity of actors available and prioritising the key barriers that these actors face. So these two starting points informed our approach to the work. Firstly, as you'll see, we take a holistic view of how infrastructure supports resilience, and also on how the infrastructure resilience depends not only on the asset configurations, but ultimately on the institutional and financial frameworks that determine these infrastructure systems. And secondly, we focus on being practical and grounding the work in real experience. So while the work draws extensively on academic and practitioner literature, we've augmented this with a new survey gathered by our colleagues at ADPC on the key issues faced by decision makers in the region. And we've highlighted opportunities to improve decision making by carrying out our own practical modelling exercises using widely available data. So with that preface, I'll hand over to my colleagues Alessa, Neeraj and Bill, who will take you through firstly the approach and our key findings, secondly some of the modelling exercises that we undertook, and finally the survey. So over to you, Alessa.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Ollie. Just to make sure everybody can hear me. I'll take that as a yes. So hi everybody, my name is Alessa Widmeyer and I'm a senior economist at Vivid Economics, and I've been closely involved in the research of this report together with my colleagues Ollie and Neeraj. And the aim of the report launched today is to highlight opportunities to strengthen infrastructure resilience in developing Asia. And the reason for this is that resilience is a critical challenge for the region because of the exposure to natural hazards, which is widespread in the region. And as you can see in the map to the right, large parts of developing Asia are at notable risk of at least one natural hazard. And as Noel already mentioned, disasters in the region are causing significant losses and affect billions of people. And in the future, we expect that this hazard exposure will further intensify because of the climate change, economic growth, and urbanization affecting the region. And so as developing Asia strives to sustain economic development and reduce poverty, measures to reduce, transfer, and manage disaster risk will be of crucial importance. And so this is where resilience planning comes in, and infrastructure has a central role to play in this, as significant investments are needed to meet Asia's infrastructure needs in the upcoming decade. And the way these investments are planned and carried out and also financed will shape the resilience in the region for the decades to come. And that's because of two reasons. So firstly, the choices made about asset locations and design will determine the hazard exposure and potential losses of these assets. And they will also affect the geographic distribution of economic activity, which will then determine where future development takes place and whether this takes place in more or less disaster-prone locations. And secondly, the choices made about infrastructure system design will also determine the knock-on effects of disasters on users and their ability to gain access to basic services in the aftermath of a disaster. So this means that if resilient measures are implemented in the upcoming investment opportunities in infrastructure in developing Asia, direct asset damage as well as adverse effects on users and the broader economy can be reduced. And to support these efforts, this report identifies opportunities to improve infrastructure resilience in developing Asia. And the opportunities that we highlight here today and in the report are inspired by barriers that currently prevent or limit progress towards increased infrastructure resilience as identified through stakeholder engagements and research. So the report finds that it's key that decision makers take resilience into account across all stages of the asset lifecycle and also backed up by a strong enabling environment. And in stakeholder engagements and best practices review, we found that there are 6 key areas of resilient infrastructure. 3 of them relate to each asset lifecycle and enabling environment. So infrastructure owners and operators should make resilience an integral part of the asset lifecycle across all stages of the life cycle. So before an investment occurs, it's key to understand and quantify the risk of disasters on the asset, users, and the wider economy. And then when deciding on the investment, decision makers should ensure that investment options are prioritized based on the resilient design, both at the asset and at the network level. And then after the investment has occurred, resilience is also an important consideration when operating and maintaining infrastructure assets to make sure that disaster preparedness and response planning is incorporated on an ongoing basis. And then on a broader level, it's also key that decision makers, particularly governments and financiers, create an enabling environment for resilient infrastructure. And they can do this by setting integrated system-wide objectives for disaster resilience, scaling up finance, and designing institutions that effectively incentivize the development of resilient infrastructure systems. And the report launched today is structured around these 6 key areas. Each of the areas highlights the current status, the barriers, best practices, and opportunities for each aspect in the region. So on this page, you see the high-level findings of the report. And based on stakeholder engagement and research, we've identified 3 key dimensions of opportunities, each of which addressing a unique set of challenges. So the first dimension of opportunities, you see that at the bottom, is to understand and account more fully for resilience benefits. In interviews, we found that experts found that disaster risk is routinely considered in infrastructure investment planning and prioritization to some extent, but planning decisions are often focused on the asset level rather than the system or user resilience. And this manifests itself in 2 different areas. For example, in that disaster resilience objectives are defined at the asset level, for example, through building codes, but they sometimes don't cover the integrated network. And secondly, investment prioritization is primarily based on financial costs and avoided future damages, but often doesn't consider broader benefits. And the result of this is that in our survey of stakeholders in the region, we found that 45% of respondents indicated that better planning is the key improvement needed to achieve infrastructure resilience. So then what's the guidance that this report can offer? So we found that conducting multi-criteria assessments and stakeholder engagements to compare investment options are key for improved resilience planning. And this means that planned resilience measures should be assessed in their ability to create a wide range of benefits and do not bring about negative unintended consequences. And this can then generate better value for money. And as part of this, the triple dividend resilience framework can be used to ensure that resilience options are not only assessed for their possible reduction in disaster losses, but also for their potential to boost economic growth and also lead to wider co-benefits, for example, inclusivity. And for this multi-criteria assessment, all relevant parties should be involved in the effort to determine the critical success factors. So that should include developers or sectoral ministers and engineers as well. The second dimension of opportunities is to improve the coordination between decision makers, as you can see on the left. So related to the last point, survey respondents pointed out that coordinating resilience investments across a wide range of stakeholders can be really challenging, especially when these stakeholders are active in different regions or sectors and have different priorities. And so as a result, there can be a disconnect between resilience planning and the longer term development strategies. And also emergency response plans may not be integrated across stakeholder groups. But given the interconnected nature of infrastructure systems, it's really crucial to create this shared vision of resilience objectives and jointly make cross-sectoral investment decisions and integrate planning. So what are the options available to decision makers? Well, one option is to make sure stakeholders get together to determine critical infrastructure links and draw up common disaster response management plans, which should have clearly defined responsibilities. And these groupings can also be formalized through designated disaster risk institutions or other governance structures. And an example of best practices is in Indonesia, where stakeholder interviews have revealed that each significant natural hazard is monitored by a dedicated institution, which takes a lead role in measuring, but also countering and recovering from hazards. The third and last dimension of opportunities we've highlighted in the report is to improve risk information. And so in our survey, respondents have revealed that improved risk information is really critical for enhancing resilience. For them, some of the biggest challenges are gaining access to up-to-date, high-quality data, and also conducting forward-looking quantitative assessments of risks and impacts. And in focus group discussions, it was also noted that stakeholders find it difficult to make a case for risk assessment because the process is often quite specific to the infrastructure investment and not standardized. And to address these difficulties, we have developed a guidance on how open source data can be used to develop replicable risk assessment approaches, which can also take into account future uncertainties. And to showcase example applications, we carried out these assessments in the context of Pakistan and Cambodia. I will now hand over to my colleague Niraj, who will give you a much more detailed overview of the assessments we carried out and also how the distilled risk information can be used to inform resilient investment decisions in the future. Over to you, Niraj.
Thank you so much, Alessa. Hi, everyone. I am Niraj Barua. I lead Vivid's work on climate and socioeconomic risk assessment. And as Ollie and Alessa mentioned before, one of the key objectives of this report was to look at practical steps in conducting a risk assessment and to offer practical guidance in overcoming some of the barriers in conducting risk assessment that we found out through the interview process. And two that Alessa just now mentioned, one was using risk data to conduct more improved risk assessments and how we can leverage open source data and tools for that purpose. And the second one is managing uncertainty and how can we use future-oriented risk data to look at future uncertain scenarios in the risk management process. And to illustrate those, we've conducted 2 case studies as part of this report. One was to look at asset criticality from seismic resilience in Pakistan, where we explore how we use open source data to conduct risk assessments in a user-friendly and accessible manner that can be replicated throughout the Asia Pacific in other data sparse environments. And the second on managing uncertainty is we explore how to use a tool called Dynamic Adaptive Policy Pathways to look at flood risk reduction investments in Cambodia. As we can see in this figure on the left, we have practical steps in how to conduct a risk assessment, and it's broken down into 3 essential stages. Once risk identification, then we have risk quantification, and finally, we have risk prioritization and decision making. Risk investments are very critical for informed decision making around resilience infrastructure, and risk assessments essentially involve analyzing how hazards give rise to impact, to support eventually decision making. And they are the foundation of effective assessment of resilience benefits that can be associated with interventions in infrastructure systems. Risk identification generally pins down the current and the future sources of risk, and it's very important how these affect and are affected by infrastructure systems. The process usually begins by identifying the key risk components. What are the relevant hazards? What are the frequency of events of varying severity? What's the extent to which infrastructure assets like roads are exposed and vulnerable? And then we move on to the impact side, where we do an assessment of the potential for the impact of hazards, also look at the potential for compound disasters, for example, an earthquake if it is followed by landslides. How an impact propagates through to the rest of the economy and the wider society can also then be considered to form a very holistic view of how impact is shaped by hazards. And lastly, we also explore the long-term stresses that look at how risk factors are expected to change over time. For example, as a result of climate change, as a result of urban growth, as a result of technological progress, or other circumstances. These high-level insights into the relevance and impact of risk can be combined into kind of like different summary channels. And then we have risk quantification, which informs the long-term decision-making by allowing resilience investments to be viewed in the context of potential losses from inaction. Once the most relevant risks have been identified, quantification helps in assessing in more detail the likelihood of disasters and the magnitude of the impact on infrastructure, but also on people and the economy, and express them in monetary and economic terms. One of the big bottlenecks, which we've already said, is the availability of up-to-date high-quality data and restricted data that kind of doesn't, it's a barrier to risk assessment. And there's a huge opportunity that we've identified here with open source data and models. They often prove to be very of sufficient depth to deliver high-level quantitative insights, especially when detailed risk modeling cannot always be carried out because of technical or other resource constraints. And at the very least, the information that can be obtained from a lot of publicly available models and sources that are there can be validated by stakeholders to help policymakers decide whether more extensive risk assessments are needed or not. And we'll use an example from Pakistan to illustrate that. Pakistan is highly prone to seismic risk, and we look at how different road infrastructure can be impacted by seismic risk using open source data and tools, and how this can be done in a replicable and very scalable manner. We look at one infrastructure sector, which is transport, roads, and earthquakes, as mentioned. We find that roads that are vulnerable to earthquake-prone areas, and then we locate a subset of those roads that are very critical for Pakistan for resilience investments. What do we mean by critical? So roads are critical in the sense that their failure, damage, or downtime is very impactful in terms of the socioeconomic activity that they support. The impact of its loss of service can be measured in many ways, how its downtime affects a large population or economy in terms of the GDP. And the risk assessment is very spatial, spatially explicit, so that it helps in spatial prioritization and in regional resource allocation. On the left, you can see the risk identification process, where we assembled and identified earthquake-prone areas in Pakistan. We define them through a hazard footprint, which is derived from historical epicenters of hazards. That's the shaded area that you can see. And then we also look at areas which have a high peak ground acceleration. So these are also areas which are very prone to earthquakes. And on the bottom image, we can see areas with very high soil liquefaction, which indicates that those are areas where the topsoil and the subsoil strength is significantly reduced when the earth shakes. So the roads there are at a high risk of caving in. On the right, we see the infrastructure assets that we've assembled, the road data that we've assembled for Pakistan. And then we identify catchment areas for all of the different important roads there in that box. We define catchment areas as spheres of influence, and the logic behind that is we want to identify the social and the economic relevance of an asset that can be estimated. So if a particular road is down, we estimate what's the surrounding population, what's the surrounding economy that's going to be impacted if that road is down, and there's no other road that can be bypassed through it. And finally, we determine the factors that determine an asset's criticality in terms of the importance of restoring the service provided by the asset in the aftermath of a disaster. We cover 3 different data points. First, economic criticality. So we measure how important the asset is for the economy through its direct and indirect links with local economic activities. So the GDP at risk that we quantify. Second, accessibility, which measures how important the asset is for societal well-being, how much access it provides to critical services like schools and hospitals, and how much remote population that it can cut off. And then finally, social criticality, which is how much of vulnerable population, so children, elderly, is likely to be cut off if that asset is down. And all of these three different elements are combined into an index of criticality, which is a simple weighted model of all of these factors that's normalized. And these weights can be user-led and changed. And the result of this exercise, we can see on the extreme right, is that which shows the network vulnerability to earthquakes in Pakistan. So the roads that we can see in red are the highly critical roads in Pakistan. We can see clusters of critical roads in dense areas in the north near the political centers of Islamabad, Lahore, and Faisalabad, and some in the extreme south near Karachi. Then there are some rural roads in the Balochistan area in the southwest, which are mostly critical in terms of vulnerable populations that would be cut off. This exercise is very useful for decision making. One, the financial analysis of criticality allows us to understand the value of money proposition behind making roads resilient. Making the most critical roads in Pakistan resilient costs a fraction of the value at risk if they fail. Approximately more than 6.5 million of low regret investment is needed to build in resilience in these critical roads, while 16.6% of GDP is at potential risk. The users also have a lot of control on what factor to lend more weight on. If social equity and accessibility is given more weight than economic exposure, then the southwestern regions of Pakistan in Balochistan would have more critical roads. This highlights the flexibility of the approach, and it can be extended to other hazards or multi-hazards as well. It's important to note that while the high-level quantification can be a catalyst for subsequent more detailed analysis, however, it does not take the place of localized risk assessments. Using open source data for high-level risk modeling provides a helpful overview of the risk hotspots and priority hazards in a larger region. Also, it's very important that throughout this process, stakeholder engagement and stakeholder management is very, very important, which we've also conducted as part of this report. And with this, I want to hand over to Bill, who will talk about the stakeholder engagement in this report.
Thank you very much, Niraj. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Ho. I'm the director from the Asian DisasterPreparedness Centre, or ADPC. It has been a great pleasure and privilege for us to work with Economics and ADB on this very important report. As my colleague Lisa and Niraj has already shared the main findings from the report, the subject at hand requires a new level of coordination and collaboration among government ministries and agencies, the private sector, and other relevant stakeholders. Therefore, the subject of stakeholder engagement is a critical component for a successful approach for resilient infrastructure. For the collection of data information to understand the baseline and to get a sense of the current state of resilient infrastructure here in the Asia-Pacific region, we're able to utilize the extensive experiences and the network connections that APs has established over the past 3 decades to maximize the engagement with relevant stakeholders. Given the sort of research or the survey portion of the report was actually done through one of the peak of the COVID-19 pandemics in the region. So all the consultations or all the meetings were conducted online, and that kind of added a level of challenges and difficulty to the process. But with the coordination of efforts of the team, we're able to implement an online survey and conduct focus group discussions or FGDs and key informal interviews in selected countries in the region. As an example, in Bangladesh, ADPC were able to conduct FGDs, or the focus group discussions, for 5 selected sectors, looking at urban infrastructure, transport, energies, communication, and water. And we were able to collect information from 32 technical experts from both the national and the local governments, very importantly, the private sectors, the operations and managers of the infrastructure assets, to really understand in terms of their challenges in delivering disaster resilience in the country and getting their recommendations and suggestions for ensuring infrastructure resilience. And of course, for the country of Nepal, we're able to conduct a similar exercise for 4 selected sectors, namely transport, energy, communications, and water. And similarly, we have collected very valuable information and input from them that we're able to use and contribute to the key findings of the report. In other regions of the Asia Pacific region, we also did key informal interviews in Indonesia and Fiji, where we really have learned a lot in terms of some of the existing modalities or mechanisms that the country has already put in place to address the issue, to ensure they can actually deliver a disaster resilience infrastructure. And of course, in the Pacific region, we're able to engage from the Pacific Island Foreign Secretariat to understand the challenges from that region, looking at delivering disaster resilience and looking for suggestions and recommendations on the subject. And because of the difficulty in terms of the COVID-19 that prohibited the travels during that period, so we're able to, working very closely with Vivid Economics, to develop an online survey that were actually distributed to the member countries of Asia Development Bank. So we're very fortunate that we not only getting the responses back from the government sectors, but we're also to be able to hear back from the infrastructure operators from the region as well. So we have actually, again, engaged the selected sectors from water, from transportation, and from communications. I actually just recently attended a workshop organized by the Thai government, actually just this morning here in Bangkok, where we really had a first sort of in-person workshop for many years, looking at the implementation of the Sendai framework in the country. But that kind of gives a really good idea and indication in terms of when you have the various different agencies and the ministries sitting together under one venue, under one roof, you can really get a lot of information, a lot of understanding in terms of what activities, what projects are implemented by the various different agencies and the ministries. And also looking at the case of Thailand with the latest National Socio-Economic National Development Plan. They all have fully aligned the National Development Plan with climate resilient issues and also disaster resilient issues. So that's also another very good potential opportunities where this could be a similar approach that could be taken for other countries to enhance the resilience infrastructure sector. So with that, we'd like to hand the floor back to Stephen. Over to you, Stephen.
Great, thank you. And yes, thank you to Ollie, Alessa, Niraj, and Bill for helping us to unpack the report. That was very useful. Let's move to the discussion and Q&A part. It's my pleasure to welcome Mario Unterweiniger from the Austrian Federal Ministry of Agriculture, Regions and Tourism. Previously, Mario served as a disaster risk management specialist with ADB, working on resilient infrastructure and worked on this report as well. So Mario, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and hi to all. My name is Mario Unterweinig, and welcome to the panel and Q&A part of this session. It's my pleasure to introduce an eminent panel of speakers from across the region, working on our collective efforts to strengthen the resilience of infrastructure to climate and disasters. The team was able to organize a very prominent but also highly competent panel. Allow me to get started by briefly introducing our four panelists. I hope we will have all four here now. We are joined today by Miss Elizabeth Betheo. Mrs. Betheo is the regional representative of Miyamoto International in the Asia Pacific region, a structural engineering and disaster risk reduction firm, where she plays a key leadership role in the development and implementation of projects and partnership across the region. Prior to her current role, she was with the World Bank and the US government, among others, where she led complex response operations. I'm also pleased to welcome Mrs. Xiaohong Yang. Mrs. Yang is the Chief Thematic Officer of ADB Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Prior to this, she served as ADB Country Director of Pakistan, the Director of the Transport and Communication Division of the Central and West Asia Department, and also Lead Transport Specialist for East Asia Department. We are also joined by Mr. Hirotsugu Mori. Mr. Mori is the Executive Technical Advisor to the Director General of the Infrastructure Management Department at the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA. Mr. Mori joined the Ministry of Infrastructure, Land and Transport in 1998, where he has worked extensively on domestic and international development. And finally, Mr. Kamal Kishore, I hope he will join us momentarily. I can't see him. He is a member of the National Indian Disaster Management Authority, or NDMA. Mr. Kishore is well known to many of us, having worked on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues for over 20 years at local, national, regional, and global levels. Prior to joining the NDMA, where he has been a driving force in the establishment of the Coalition for Disaster and Resilient Infrastructure, he worked in the United Nations Development Program for well over a decade. I hope you have the possibility to join, Kamal. And I'm going to kick off the conversation with our panelists. We will have 2 rounds of discussion with our panel before we start with the Q&A part from the audience. So please raise your questions in the chat box. And like mentioned by Steve at the beginning, and I will now bring in Elizabeth into the first round of questions. Oftentimes the discussion of private sector engagement in infrastructure emphasizes financing as the dominant pathway. While the report highlights opportunities around scaling up financing for resilient infrastructure, what are other ways the private sector can and should also be engaged in this agenda? Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you to the distinguished presenters, the panelists, and the leadership at the Asian Development Bank for this report, the excellent examples, the practical guidance, and for the opportunity to have this discussion. We are really honored to be joining you today. So why are we here? With our multi-hazard engineering capabilities and disaster risk reduction focus, our mission is to make the world a better and safer place. And in doing so, we save lives and impact economies. And as we heard today, disaster-related infrastructure damage results in the loss of life, in negative economic impacts, and disrupts the delivery of services. Repeated shocks and stresses stunt economic growth and wipe out development gains. Climate-related infrastructure damage can do the same. The impact of drought, flood, wind, and more lead to power outages, adverse effects on water supply, health services, and disrupt supply chains and businesses. Over and over, as we've heard on the panel, we see that governments must move money to reconstruction and rebuilding. And we also see that often those who are hardest hit are those with the least adaptive capacity, those living in the most at-risk areas, the most socially disadvantaged, where social and economic impacts are exacerbated. So I really want to underscore the importance of the various messages that we heard today, that it's infrastructure for resilience, not simply infrastructure resilience. The broader systems approach, not infrastructure only as an asset, but the contribution of the assets to the system, looking at community aspects and policy and governance and coordination is multifaceted. And as we've heard, emergency response and speedy recovery is part of this. Asset maintenance and planning are part of resilience. Embedding technology, institution building, and more are all a part of this. So we're a partner in that process. We bring an implementation perspective to the dialogue. We work closely with governments, local organizations, and private sector actors to be able to deliver those results and grow local capacity. So the private sector is really key in all of those aspects of delivering disaster resilience for infrastructure, not just scaling up the financing part. So let me just mention briefly 4 ways that we have done this in Latin America, the Caribbean, and in this region, looking at really critical pathways. So one is information sharing for innovation. Assessments and data, we talked a lot about that. The collection and use is an opportunity for the engagement of a variety of public and private actors, the engagement of professional associations and universities and research institutions, as well as chambers of commerce and business associations. So that information sharing link for innovation is critical to include the private sector. Another is promoting standards development and common practices. So really looking at some of the tools and the protocols and joint trainings and joint action planning to make policy guidance really work on the ground. That's another area where private sector needs to be deeply engaged. Another is leveraging public and private multi-stakeholder engagement to really influence the development outcomes. So that's really what we discussed here, working across national disaster management authorities and ministries, but also business associations, professional associations, to do the preparedness work and thinking together upstream and in advance to really build that shared vision, that shared planning. Private sector needs to be a part of that. And another is, as a private sector actor, and finally, to influence private sector's engagement in challenging environments, to really push and foster that cooperation for resilience in complex spaces. So that again is coming to this notion of needing a seat at the table to really look at those kinds of common objectives as we move forward. Thank you so much. Back over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I especially like you're mentioning the infrastructure for resilience and not only the resilient infrastructure. I think that's very important and highlights the importance of this topic. Thank you. I'll now bring in Shahong. From your vast experience across the regions to MDBs and especially ADB needs to reposition their approach to financing infrastructure given the increasing risk from climate change and natural hazards. What more can MDBs do to ensure that the infrastructure they finance is resilient to the risks they faced? Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Mariel. I'm so happy to see Elizabeth, who gave a wonderful kickoff, and that is really very nicely summarized. I think as MDB, Multilateral Development Bank, we can do a lot as what we can see, right? So often it is not really caught by everybody's attention. Only after disasters, people realize how important we should come up together, right? So it's really a very important area for all of us to get involved. Not just, Elizabeth talked very, very well on how the private sector could work together, sitting together in a table. As ADB, we should be able to work at sub-regional level, regional level, national level, provincial level, district levels. That really very, very important. When it comes to disasters, we need to also look at the disaster assessment. We can do early warning, emergency response, disaster financing, of course, building infrastructure for disaster resilience, very important, as she summarized very well. So one area we struggle a lot is do disaster risk identification. And we often, in many countries, we actually found out the physical impact on the country and its people not really very well understood by many populations. I just give you a quick sample because I have been a CD in my job very recently. The annual economic impact of flooding alone in Pakistan, it is about 1.2 billion to 2 billion already, a very large amount of GDP annually. But however, a large, major flood that may be occurring like once 100 years, it will cause losses in excess of maybe 20 billion already. So it's 20 times higher, right? So, and it's really a huge burden on the national budget. So how do we really build the infrastructure so that has the protective capacity against the future adverse, the natural disaster and events will be very, very critical So I can come on and on to talk about how important it is to really set up policies like national level disaster risk reduction policies will pave the way to come up with some national risk management fund, national risk management strategy to put this into the national budget and also into public financial management of disaster risk would be very, very important. I stop here. Thank you. Over back to you, Maria.
Thanks, Xiaohong. I think I think that one of two main points which I took off your answering is that risk identification is very, very important, and also the point to set up these national DRM issues in the national policy. So these 2 points are also highlighted in the report. So I think that's really quite important. So the next question will be for Mori-san. Mori-san, under Japan's leadership of the G20, a set of principles for quality infrastructure investments was agreed. How is JICA supporting countries in Asia and the Pacific to benefit from or implement all these principles? So Mori-san, please come in. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mori Hirotsugu. It's a great pleasure to participate in this seminar on think about disaster risk reduction. I'm Executive Technical Advisor, Infrastructure Management Department, JICA headquarters. JICA is conducting international cooperation about a lot of infrastructure projects. Our goal issues we are tackling transport and urban development and disaster risk reduction. My work is about infrastructure planning and development management, especially about the transport sector, but not disaster risk reduction. But JICA's cooperation is mainly about infrastructure development, and the transport sector is the largest sector in JICA's cooperation. And the infrastructure should be required to be a quality infrastructure as well as resilience in many points of view. Because as you know, Japan has a lot of many experience about the disaster. More than 10 years ago, major earthquakes was hit in Japan, in Tohoku. At the time, the total of number of the dead people is over the 16,000 people, and famous is about accident in nuclear plants. Anyway, for Japan, we have to share information, our experience about our disaster experience. But we have to think about consideration of the development of infrastructure. We have to think about wide range. I mean, from planning stage to designing stage and construction stage, and also maintenance stage. So when it comes to the think about the development of infrastructure, we have to think about resilience, infrastructure resilience from planning and design, construction and maintenance. First, we would like to talk about the planning stage. JICA has a lot of cooperation on the planning of infrastructure, such as master plan on urban development or master plan for overall transportation. For making plan on infrastructure, it is important to first evaluate the proper disaster risk about the area where we planned. Secondly, to make development plan of facilities to minimize the disaster risk. Third point is to evaluate economic and financial analysis and think about organization to operate the infrastructure. For example, when I plan about the master plan for the roadmap of development on transport sector in Manila in Philippines, we have to think about the not only about transport sector, but also we have to think about the disaster risk reduction. So we have to we made these plan analyzing risk of earthquake and tsunami and flood, and we have to make a conclusion for this matter. Second point is about the design stage and construction stage. JICA has a lot of infrastructure project about disaster risk reduction. For example, we have a we agreed that the JICA agreed that the investment for disaster risk reduction would increase. So that's why JICA has a lot of infrastructure development about the disaster risk reduction, such as construction of floodway or river improvement like that. Besides, it is important to think about existing infrastructure. It's important to maintenance and the operation should be better. So, but in reality, in many developing countries, maintenance budget are not enough. But we should understand infrastructure, especially for transport infrastructure, could be the important facility to ensure the logistics or transport of emergency relief goods. So JICA has a lot of technical cooperation in infrastructure asset management, such as road asset management like that. JICA tackling to improve the road management measure as well as organization, establishment, and human resource management, etc. To summarize my speech, we should take comprehensive approach to build resilience against natural hazard and other risks from planning side to maintenance stage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Morris, and a lot. I think Japan has really a lot of experience in dealing with all these natural hazards, and I think it's great to share this info. Like you mentioned, the maintenance aspect, the technical cooperation for the transport sector. So this is quite important. I have seen that Kamal was able to join. Welcome, Kamal, and thanks again for joining this webinar. I have already introduced you, and I will go directly to your question. Kamal, how can governments such as India ensure the balance between regulations that promote resilient infrastructure and creating and enabling environment for much needed infrastructure investments? Thanks, Kamal.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. You know, in a country where there is a large infrastructure deficit and we are in an infrastructure building frenzy, we have to quickly make infrastructure to provide the services to people who haven't had services for a long time, basic services emanating from infrastructure systems. And yet, we have to provide them in a manner that it is sustainable, it is high quality, it is dependable, and it is resilient. So basically, three things come to my mind. First thing is that, our colleague from JICA was talking about that if we begin to think about infrastructure not just as discrete assets, but systems that deliver services, and if the public narrative is about delivering services from infrastructure systems rather than just constructing infrastructure assets for their own sake. So I think then it would require us to imagine infrastructure systems not in silos, but cutting across different sectors, realizing that in a global system that we live right now, the impacts ripple across multiple sectors. The the multiple infrastructure sectors and multiple geographies. So it's really an integrated planning which provides quick, good services to people in an integrated way. That's the first point. The second point is that we also have to think about not just risk to infrastructure, but also risk from infrastructure. There are many instances where we look at a very well-built metro line or a road, which is very resilient to wet and windy conditions by itself. But in the manner it has been built, it is creating downstream risks for the others by compromising drainage lines, for example. So how do we sort of have a complete, a bigger view of resilience where we are not looking at the asset by itself, but the downstream effect it is leading to? And my third point on that is that we really have to sort of break the silo also of gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. We can't have a system where infrastructure is, the human-built infrastructure is planned by ministries and departments with a lot of money, and gray infrastructure, the wetlands and mangroves and sand dunes are looked at only by the Ministry of Environment. We really have to think about that in an integrated way, not just looking at how to minimize the impact of gray infrastructure on green infrastructure. No, not like that. But well, I mean, that's a traditional approach, but really looking at it as an integrated system that provides services to society.
Thanks, Kamal, for your question, for your answer. And I really like the point of breaking down the silos, because I think this is one of the main challenges in our times, that everything is so complex and interconnected, and for that we have to break down the silos and to make this integrated approach provided by your answer. So we will have a second round of questions, and due to shortness of time, I will ask you to give us a very, very brief and short answer. So the next question will be again for you, Elizabeth. Working for a company like Miyamoto that delivers infrastructure for resilience, can you speak a bit about the role of this system perspective? This was mentioned by Kamal and also Maurice-Anne and Shahong. How do you work on governance and management for infrastructure systems and support decision-making processes? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, it's a very big question. So I will take the very short form of that, focusing on, really better planning and improved risk information. So let me just talk a little bit about, one way is we generate and move information around with an understanding of what information matters for whom with the decision-making process. So really trying to empower with data. And the point there is to get on the front foot, to get a sense of the emerging risk that's place-based and the community view that enables the understanding of not just the asset, but the government process, provide the opportunity to think about priorities of investments in a different way. And so, one of the things I also wanted to say in this report in this region, as we talk about data for decision-making, we certainly work on multi-hazard risk. I think all of us work on multi-hazard risk, but important to note in that stakeholder survey of infrastructure stakeholders across the region, that earthquakes were the most listed primary hazard of concern among the respondents, followed by flooding and tropical cyclones. So we have to keep in mind that that's really critical. And so a lot of our programs in this region have focused on seismic risk in Indonesia and elsewhere. And that, just to say again, that risk assessment process is critical because the solid understanding of risk is the foundation to understanding what the resilience benefits could be from a systems perspective. So if the risks are not well understood, then the decisions may not be well prioritized and opportunities may be missed to reduce or manage risk in a cost-effective way. So, it's everything that we talked about in terms of the presentation, risk identification, quantifying that risk. And then super critical is the effective communication, that the outcomes need to be communicated back to the stakeholders and with the stakeholders using the information that's relevant to their needs and the decisions that they need to make so that it's actionable and it's relevant and it can be prioritized in the planning process.
Thanks, Elizabeth. This was great because it was a very complicated answer and question and a very, very short answer from your side. Thank you. So Kamal, again, picking up your point on the infrastructure and the breaking down the silos, the report talks about broadening objectives for disaster resilience beyond the focus on asset level loss and damage. Given the existing structure in place whereby sectors are responsible for delivering infrastructure, how can we broaden thinking around system resilience and to better recognize all these cascading risks mentioned before? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I would say there are, again, three approaches. Number one, I think we have to have, I wouldn't call it centralized planning, but integrated planning systems at different levels. You know, we cannot stay locked into sectors. At the national level, subnational level, local level, we really need to pursue integrated planning. And the second thing is that this integrated planning needs to be underpinned by solid risk information, which should be a public good. And this is a tedious, less attractive, less interesting job of making good risk information available, you know, which requires having good observational networks, you know, interoperable databases, and so on. And I think that's where particularly the public sector needs to play a much bigger role in providing that service to the designers, developers, and maintainers. And finally, it is all about money. The financing mechanisms for infrastructure development have to be structured in a manner that it nudges us towards resilience. We need to talk to our central banks about how do you structure the financial system in a manner that infrastructure investments incentivize us to move towards resilience and not look at short-term gains and lock us into long-term risks. Thank you.
Thanks, Kamal. I think money is very critical and a very good handover to the next question to Xiaohong. Xiaohong, going to the upstream now, whether it's the SDGs, the Sendai framework, the G20 principles for quality infrastructure investments, it's clear that governments and organizations, including ADB, are committed to disaster resilient infrastructure. What opportunities do you see to accelerate action given the continued concentration of people and assets in hazard exposed areas? Not only just the money aspect, but I am sure that there are many other aspects. Thank you.
I think Camille already made it a very good point. Policy is very important. Institutions also very important. I would like to highlight that because he also highlighted the importance of all the layers support at the administrative layers, right? One example I can give is in Pakistan, we set up this National Risk Management Fund. It is set up as a government-owned non-profit company by the government with the support from ADB, with one of the objectives is to develop the strategy, institutionalize it at different levels. And also we prepared in the mechanism for us to actually mobilize funding because money talks, right? As Camille mentioned. So the climate finance is super, super important. So we need an approach that has the potential to attract the climate finance and also increase the country focus on the DRR, the disaster risk reduction. So when the fund, at the peak time, the fund attracted 0.5 billion when I was working there. So it was to create some momentum around really the National Flood Protection 4 when we had that implementation. Because the previous, you have a lot of National Flood Protection Plan, but was not funded. So only when you have these mechanisms in place that is properly funded. So additional planned investment in all kinds of sectors, it is very critical. It's not just the one transport sector or the irrigations or agriculture or power sector. It has to be an overall integrated planning process, and that all the layers of the government think thoroughly how to do design. And also we generally found out, I think JECA summarized very well, JECA colleagues, generate pipeline is also very difficult. There's really a need to have upfront investment or even the cost sharing basis for planning and designing the DRR activities and climate change investment, because we have to look at the DRR from climate change resilience perspective that can be really used to develop and provide a steady stream of the mature and well-designed DRR investment. I think that is very critical. We see a lot of developed countries need that kind of upstream momentum support and also investment. I stop here. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Xiaohong, for your answer. So the last question for Mori-san will be following on from that, given Japan's first-hand experience with disasters you mentioned in your previous answer, and the ongoing risk to this critical infrastructure. What lessons can developing Asia draw? What is JICA prioritizing or promoting to achieve this disaster resilient infrastructure? So please give us an answer, and if you are able, please be short so that we have a little bit time for the Q&A session. Thanks, Mori-san.
Okay, thank you. I would like to say that as the report would already mention, that infrastructure are managed by many kind of organizations, such as transport sector, energy sector, the river control sector, and by central government, local government, public corporation, and private companies like so on. So I believe that all organizations involved in management infrastructure should take approach to resilience against natural disaster. But what kind of approach should be done? First one is development of hardware infrastructure to build infrastructure, just like reservoir or floodway and the reinforcement for earthquake resistance. But the development of infrastructure is a huge cost, but we have to need a budget. Another one is to utilize of existing infrastructure by proper asset management, by proper maintenance. This approach should be changed to proper maintenance about preventative maintenance approach from conventional spot recovery management. And the third one is about the approach about the capacity development about the disaster, just about the software. For example, collecting and utilizing information on disaster, as well as disaster risk evaluation. These measures include the introduction and utilization of the information and communication technology and establishment of information network disaster. And we have to prepare for the future disaster based on the prepared business continuous plan. And that approach is not expensive, but it is necessary to improve the organization and human welfare improvement. Anyway, we have to take approach from hardware side to software side. That balance is important. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you, and for your great answers. And I will move over to the questions from the floor. I will ask Oliver Walker from Vivid Economics and the team to join us. I will read the questions. If we don't have enough time to answer all of your questions, we are collecting the questions and we will submitting you the answers via email. So don't be afraid, you will come to your answer. So I think the first question is from James Reeves. I think it's related to Mirage. He's writing that they did some work for the World Bank looking at the economic costs of disasters on the road network in Tajikistan. And this involved an assessment of the wider impacts of disaster. He is interested to understand how the proportion of GDP at risk was determined, and many impacts of disasters are short-term, and the effects on GDP is very small, and others including like long-term intergenerational poverty with long-term effects are a longer one. So please, Niraj, Oli, or whoever have something to say to these questions, please come in. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mario, and to James for the really important question. I think really what the approach Niraj illustrated on asset criticality is around how we build up risk narratives in a way that's kind of consistent across sectors and across regions. We develop a kind of common and practical framework for understanding how risks propagate across from infrastructure to more wider social and economic systems, and then developing data to quantify those impacts. I don't think we then need to be very prescriptive about precisely how you utilize all of that data to make decisions, but by going through that process of understanding and prioritizing impacts, that not only helps you, make a prioritized decision, but also helps you understand what it is that you can do, rather than taking a very narrow view around asset protection, taking the systems view, thinking about nature-based solutions, many of the kind of alternatives that we suggest in the paper. I don't know if any of the other speakers would like to build on that.
I can, if I may.
Thanks, Sharon.
Okay, Mario, it is because I happen to work in Tajikistan when I was a director for Central West for ADB for more than 5 years. And for people who really traveled in Tajikistan, that corridor, you will know that, for example, the Dushanbe to Bishkek road corridor that was actually rehabilitated by ADB, that is the only lifeline of that corridor. So there is no other way of the local populations if that corridor is going to be flooded or going to be earthquake or whatever disaster happened to the local population. So that is the only life link there. And in Tajikistan, 95% of the terrain is mountainous. So it is also very difficult when the raining season, flood season, winter season comes, it will be quite tough for the local population. So in those particular very harsh situations, road is actually the only way. There's no railway there. The air transportation is not very reliable, right? Because of the shortage of the fuel. The national Tajikistan airline is not really having regular services. So it is so critical in those circumstances, you have to plan in a way to put the local population and their needs to really, really very critical situation. I did the JFPR project, it's Japan Poverty Reduction Fund, which is building bridges, rehabilitation bridges. I was the team leader for that one. So as Oliver said, it is really difficult in a country context like Tajikistan. You need to, how you actually integrate the risk factors into this kind of projects, so critical. Thank you.
Thanks, Shahong, and thanks, Oliver. One question is for Kamal. India has had the CDRI. What opportunities are these to support members take action? It's yeah, it's a question of knowledge, it's a capacity question, it's a question of finance. You mentioned it already, money is very important. Where should these efforts be focused? So thank you, Kamal.
So thank you very much, Mario, for that question. So CDRI is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and we are very happy that Asian Development Bank is one of the founding members of the coalition, and it's a knowledge partnership. And I think the kind of times we are living in, no country, whether it's a developed country or developed country, can do it alone. You know, countries like mine have large infrastructure deficit. You know, advanced economies have a situation where they have to replace their infrastructure. It's completing its life cycle. So there is an opportunity for peer-to-peer learning both ways. It's not just south-south or north-south. It's south-south, north-south, south-north. So we really hope that CDRI can serve as a platform, a knowledge-sharing platform to make this happen. I'll give you an example of the work of CDRI on looking at resilience of power systems in cyclone-prone areas. And there are huge learnings there. You know, even without hardening the power infrastructure in coastal areas that are exposed to cyclones, there are opportunities to reduce the recovery time by 80% by simple measures. And once you bring in how you harden the infrastructure to better standards, you can reduce the recovery time even higher. So that's just one example. We don't have a lot of time to go in depth into it, but that's not something that into one coastal area. Can we together commit globally that all the cyclone-prone areas across the world, cyclone, hurricane, typhoon-prone areas across the world, will have power systems that will be so resilient that once a big storm strikes, the recovery time will be less than 24 hours. Together, we can do it.
I think that's very important, Kamal, what you mentioned, that you have the possibility to react quite quickly. So one next question will be for Ollie. Mori-san also highlighted the importance of risk-informed master plans. What did the report say about this? Are these plans integrated already in some countries, or what is your opinion? Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. I'm not sure who it came from, but I think it's an absolutely fundamental issue, and it's highlighted as one of the first opportunities in the paper. It's critical that resilience is fully embedded within national development strategies, and furthermore, it's critical that there is sort of institutional support to ensure that there is this consistent approach to understanding risk and acting upon risk embedded across decision making within all of the relevant stakeholders, line ministries, infrastructure operators. So it's not only the plan itself, but it's also the kind of institutional basis for that plan that's critical, and that's something that we emphasize in reports. Are these plans integrated? There are some examples. I think we highlight the Philippines as one case in the report, and that there are others as well. But it's something that I think we see from the survey data and from a review of practice is really still emerging both at the planning level and at the institutional level.
Thanks, Ollie. Mori-san, do you want something to add to this question?
Okay, thank you. JICA's cooperation is about the planning. It's just a way that adapt the planning in Japan's way, maybe similar way of Japan, because Japan has a lot of experience of disaster. So when we make a master plan in Japan, we have to evaluate the disaster risks very sufficiently. So we'd like to transfer this our experience to make a master plan in developing country. So Asian country has a lot of a similar risk as Japan's risk of disaster. So I think it is very effective to make a plan considering and analysis the disaster risk. That's why we made a plan with analyze disaster risk sufficiently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ole and Morrison. Elizabeth, you raised your hands, but please be quick. I'm sure you are very advanced in being quick. So thank you.
Wonderful. I just wanted to say that this is part of the reason that it's so challenging, because all of us have talked about systems and multi-stakeholders, both within government, outside government, private sector, community. You know, what's really critical to the planning process is it's not something that is out there. It is about coming together to have a common mental model about what is the vision, what is the direction, and then how are we as a collective going to get there? Because we've talked about each stakeholder group has a role to play. And so I don't want that to get lost, that it's not so much the plan is the end result, but everything that comes before, the common understanding, the common information, the common vision, the common direction, all of that needs time and attention to get a plan that has the necessary buy-in to make the kind of change that we are all talking about. Back over to you.
Thanks. You were quick again. So one short message from Shahong. Shahong, please come in.
Very short. I just want to carry on, Elizabeth. It is not just the mapping, but also the rules and responsibilities of each stakeholder in disaster resilience reduction is very important. They need to understand, because in many DMCs, they just try to decentralize the responsibility to the local level without giving them the power to, without the budget allocation, without the technical expertise, without the data mapping. That is the common issue we are facing. So the rules, responsibilities of each stakeholder needs to be clearly articulated in the plan and understood by everyone. Thank you.
Thanks to Elizabeth and also Shahong. Yeah, I'm afraid that the time is over now. Allow me to thank the really excellent panel, Elizabeth, Shahong, Kamal, Morrison, and Oli, and the team for their contribution today, and also submitting everybody who has submitted questions. We will answer them via email if you haven't get a response now. And let me hand back to Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. Let me add my thanks to the panel as well. That was really rich and really thought-provoking. I think together with those answers and the report, there's really a lot to digest. And probably our 90-minute session wasn't enough. So we hope that this has at least given you a taste of what the report presents in much more detail. And as I said, that report is now online on ADB's website, and we will share a link to all of the participants of today's webinar so that you can read that further. So with that, again, let me thank all of our speakers and discussants. Let me thank participants for joining. What I hope you also found to be a very interesting session. And with that, I thank you and I wish you a good day from Manila.